Welcome back to the Podium Performance Podcast, where we talk about physical performance. I'm your host, Coach Tony. You can find this podcast on YouTube or on iTunes and Spotify podcasts. In the last episode, I spoke about speed and being fast in different ways. Today, I'm going to talk about work capacity and stamina, defining it, how to measure it, and metrics to predict it. For those watching on YouTube, remember to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment. For those listening on iTunes or Spotify podcasts, remember to subscribe. Welcome to episode 6. Something that is amazing when it comes to measuring work capacity is there are many different ways to measure and quantify it, and today we have many ways of tracking, from simple apps, journals, training logs, wearables, and high-tech gadgets and tools. These can measure nearly everything from volume of oxygen consumed, your heart rate, core temperature, mileage of volume, respiratory rate, step, stroke, or revolution rate, all the way into your actual work rate and productivity. While these are what we look at for sport or exercise performance, we can also look at things like reading speed, transactions per hour, items scanned, accuracy, and even sleep quality. At the end of the day, work capacity is simply the amount of work that you can do or perform before becoming exhausted. In the regular job world, which, let's face it, that's where 99% of the world operates, this is also going to be related to things such as burnout and when you become too exhausted from work, you end up with overly high levels of stress, which require stress leave. One of the aspects of work capacity is that it can be both very general or highly specific, while also being quite possibly the single most trainable aspect of performance. What I mean by this is that we have a pool of energy that we can tap into. For those watching on YouTube, just think, a bottle of water. You can fill it up to the max. You only have that much water in the bottle. Very specific tasks that require immense focus or effort can drain this energy pool at an exponentially greater rate. The harder you work, the faster the energy depletes. If we're looking at a car, for example, the harder you step on the accelerator, the faster you deplete the gas in the car. Your day-to-day life will be a general work capacity. There is only so much that you can actually get done in a day. Meanwhile, a surgeon performing open heart surgery, for example, and transplantation has a very specific task. Or a 400-meter sprinter can only output at their maximum output for a very short period of time, which isn't even the full length of the race. However, with training, your work capacity and your ability to perform the task for a longer period of time at a higher intensity even does improve. Training can be both general or highly specific. The more specific the task, the more specific the training needs to be. You're not going to get better at lifting weights by doing Excel spreadsheets, or better at being there for your patients as a psychiatrist by running hills. The more fit that you are, however, the more work in any domain the fitter you are, the more work you're able to perform in essentially any domain, whether it's physical or psychological. At the end of the day, work capacity is simply the amount of work that you are capable of doing before you break. Sometimes this can mean that you just can't do any more in terms of the body's tissues. Sometimes this literally means how much the tissue can handle before it breaks and injury occurs, whether this is a physical part of the body breaking or mentally you break and you need time off work. This is why work capacity is one of the most important physical traits for performance and injury resilience. You cannot perform if you are injured or off work. It's that simple. In today's world, we have sexy and unsexy ways of measuring, gauging, and tracking work capacity or predicting readiness to perform from how well recovered you are and how well you have slept. So let's talk about traditional ways that we can visualize and quantify a person's work capacity. At what point can you no longer maintain the same output intensity, and also how long can you go before you have to actually stop, or how many repetitions you can complete? This can be completed in many ways, from rowing, cycling, and running, An example would be you can row at an output of 200 watts for 10 minutes before you have to slow down, or you can do 8 repetitions of 20 seconds on the bike at 150 RPMs with 10% of your body weight as resistance with 60-second rest before you can no longer continue. Strength training can be treated much the same way as conditioning in terms of measuring work capacity, but here it is the total tonnage or how many reps and sets you can do with a certain weight or repetition maximum, or under different rest requirements and time under tension parameters. For all of these, you can also easily see improvements or regressions. The thing is, we typically only think about work capacity, but every single day we have other ways of measuring it. So let's take a look at real-world examples, real-world examples as well on just sport. Your employer has measures for it, but they call it something different. They call it productivity. Think about those lines at the checkout at Costco, for example. How would you measure things here? Well, the thing is, a massive corporation like Costco and the large grocery chains actually do measure it, especially when they're doing billions of dollars in sales in a year. Their metrics are going to be things like transactions per hour or number of items scanned per minute, how long it takes you to process a transaction. Amazon fulfillment centers are going to look at number of packages you're able to fulfill per shift or per hour, how long your bathroom breaks are. That's why there's so much controversy around the Amazon fulfillment centers and how they track things down to the second. Now we take a look in some of the medical world. How many patients can a therapist see in a day before needing either a break between to recover or needing the day to be over with? In surgery, there's an incredible amount of focus required, as a person's hands are literally in the surgeon's hands. So how long can the team of medical professionals continue performing the surgery before either needing a brief break or tagging in another team to continue? This can be critical for serial surgeries in trauma, where one surgery must be completed and performed before you can move on to the next one in order to save a person's life. All while the rest of the medical team there is tracking other metrics like blood saturation levels, heart rate, blood loss, brain activity, medication administration, metabolizing rate, so how quickly the medication is in and out of the system. All of these are being assessed, measured, and tracked in real time under immense stressful situations. If you are a student or anybody that has studied or is studying a topic or for an exam, there is only so much studying you can effectively do before either you lose interest, you take a nap. Let's face it, studying can be quite boring. That's why a lot of students end up going to the library, they study for a bit, next thing you know, they're face down in the book, passed out, because the material isn't highly stimulating, or they've just simply gone past what their threshold of work capacity for studying at that time is. But you can improve this. By studying what interests you, you're going to be able to study longer because you're stimulated. Or simply by titrating up or slowly increasing the amount of time you study day to day so that you're able to handle longer bouts of studying. It's just like running a race. You don't go from 0 to a marathon. You start out with shorter distances and work up to it. Just think of studying and even the surgical room as mental marathons. In some workplaces, many of the factors of work capacity have to do more so with the mental side, from staring at a screen all day to dealing with people, let's face it, that can be mentally strenuous, or performing highly mentally complex work, like doing surgery. Meanwhile, in manual labor jobs like construction or mining, the physical body is where the capacity is going to be limited the most. However, all jobs require a continuum of both. The environment is also going to heavily influence the work capacity of a person. The weather, temperature, elevation are going to each have massive impacts on your work capacity. These are a few of the major impacts, as well as equipment being used, Now, yes, there are some predictor metrics that can influence one's work capacity. Some require much more gadgets for measurements than others, and some of them are exceedingly expensive and are just simply outside of the budget of a regular person outside the laboratory setting. Each of those aforementioned parameters is going to get its own episode or episodes because they are so important for human performance, whether it's mental or physical. So let's take a look at some of these metrics that we need to look at. Your heart rate, one of the absolute easiest metrics to measure because you can do it simply just with 2 fingers up against your carotid artery or at your wrist. If you're extremely sensitive, you can even test it at the thumb. And all you need then is a stopwatch, but you can also get a dedicated heart rate monitor strap from a company like Polar. Some watches now even have a built-in heart rate monitor. So a person's heart rate is a massive predictor of work capacity because the heart is what gets oxygen and nutrients to the muscles and also removes metabolic byproducts known as metabolites from the working muscles. When doing most tasks, our heart rate will remain fairly stable once it has risen to the required state. For example, while I was scripting this out, I checked what my heart rate was, and it was sitting at 50 beats per minute. So this wasn't the most strenuous task. My typical resting heart rate sits in the mid-40s. It's not the most demanding task for me to script something out. However, if I were to run, my heart rate is going to increase because it requires much more demand. So if you go out and you're walking at a leisurely pace, your heart rate is going to rise and then it's going to level off to the actual demands that are required. So it will go up, it'll surpass it, and then it'll come back down and level off, type of thing. This happens up until the point of your lactate threshold. This is when you have maximized what your aerobic system can handle, so how well oxygen is actually going to be the primary energy system. And once you pass your actual lactate threshold, now your heart rate is going to start to go up a little bit quicker. We've all heard the theoretical number of what your max heart rate is. It's 220 minus your age. So by monitoring the heart rate, you can see when a person is approaching the point of fatigue, when there is a large inflection point with a rapid increase in heart rate. So just think, if you go from your resting heart rate being 60, you start to exercise, okay, it goes up to 100, 120, you start to get a little tired, all of a sudden that heart rate is going to start to go up and get closer and closer to what your theoretical maximum heart rate is, and then when you're there for too long, you're going to tap out. So other situations like this is if you are doing interval or repetitively strenuous tasks, the heart rate will rise, it'll spike and descend, so it has peaks and valleys with it. However, even mentally strenuous tasks can cause this as well. Just think of when you're about to write a test or even get in the car to drive and you're a little nervous, it's at nighttime and it's raining, or you're about to go in for a job interview. Your heart rate spikes up, you're nervous, the adrenaline's going, you can almost feel your heartbeat in your ears, type of thing. That's because you're getting ready for something strenuous, but in this case, that's mentally strenuous. When the body is tapped out of what it can do, the heart rate will no longer have those drops when you're doing the interval exercises. It's just simply going to stay elevated. And if it stays above roughly 85% of your maximum heart rate for too long, you're going to pop. And by pop, I mean you're most likely going to throw up at that point. Present party included. When I used to run track, this would happen typically on Saturdays. You'd see bodies strewn around the track on Saturday mornings because you're working so hard at such a high output that you're no longer able to recover by the end of the track workout. And as weird as it seems, your body ends up throwing up. The weird thing, you feel a little bit better afterwards. The next metric we're going to take a look at is O2 saturation levels. What this is the oxygen saturation of the blood. While this is not commonly used for many people, it's crucial in the medical setting and also those exercising at various elevations or altitudes. We can measure this with a pulse oximeter that just clips onto your finger. This is far less convenient than it might sound because it has a clip on there and it can impede how you move around and a lot of them have a wire attached to them. In the medical setting, it clips onto the finger and it's usually attached to a monitor. These days, you have the option, or we have the technology for Bluetooth and wireless ones. Even some watches have the measurement included in them, like the Apple Watch Ultra 2, which is no longer able to be sold in the US because of a patent issue that's being solved in the courts. So our blood has an oxygen-carrying molecule in red blood cells called hemoglobin. The normal blood O2 saturation levels is about 97 to 98%, and this is needed for keeping muscles fueled, but even more importantly, your brain. You may wonder why this isn't 100%. That's because there's an exchange of O2 and CO2, so oxygen and carbon dioxide, for your blood to carry to your lungs. Your blood carries the O2 from your lungs to the working muscles and to tissues. It then, through a form of osmosis or through a respiratory process, the O2 disassociates from the hemoglobin and gets brought into the working tissue, in this case muscle, to a molecule called myoglobin. The myoglobin releases CO2, carbon dioxide, which then binds to the hemoglobin to then be transferred back to the lungs for you to breathe it out. So as I'm talking and saying this, I'm actually breathing out carbon dioxide that was used by working muscles and tissues in my body. Also, the reason this will never be 100%, no system is 100% efficient. Now, in doing exercise, there is a potential for the O2 saturation levels to drop. As elevation or altitude increases, air becomes thinner, so there's less actual oxygen molecules in the same space of air. The air is thinner. So the actual air pressure when you go higher decreases. So if you're accustomed to living near sea level and then you go and play basketball in Denver, for example, your blood saturation levels will actually drop, and it can drop precipitously fast. As the blood saturation levels drop, your heart rate is going to skyrocket because your muscles are demanding oxygen. They're not getting the oxygen from the blood, but our brain says, I need to breathe faster in order to get more in. I'm breathing faster. In order to get that blood moving, the heart has to contract and beat faster. So all of this is a bit of a chain reaction that happens. If your blood saturation levels start dropping below about 90%, fine motor skills start to suffer and they continue to drop. So being able just to write or being able to pick up certain things and manipulate your fingers starts to become harder, and you start to lose track of what you're doing. If your blood saturation levels drop even further, your mental capacities start to flee you. You can even start to hallucinate, and this happens with mountain climbers. Those who do the summit climb to Mount Everest, this isn't an uncommon occurrence for them, particularly on the way down, as weird as that might seem coming down. But remember, they're 8,000 meters. They're 27,000 feet above sea level. So you can actually end up having, if your blood saturation level starts to drop below about 75 to 70%, when it starts to come below there, you likely start to lose consciousness and pass out. This is critical for pilots and why airliners are pressurized. So the planes you fly in between cities, they're pressurized. The prior generations of airliners are pressurized to about 8,000 feet above sea level, and newer ones like the Boeing 787 Dreamliner and the Airbus A350 are pressurized to about 5,000 feet above sea level. Meanwhile, you're flying at 40,000 feet. The reason for this is so that you won't pass out. And also, the air temperature outside at 40,000 feet is about negative 60 degrees Celsius, so you would freeze. But the air pressure outside the cabin, you would most likely pass out within seconds because your blood saturation levels would drop right off as soon as you started breathing. Aircraft not pressurized actually require oxygen for pilots and passengers to take with them, and a mask for them to breathe oxygen if they are flying above 10,000 feet. This is the critical altitude where mental capacity and consciousness is impacted. In the event of pressure loss in an airliner, your pilot does an emergency descent to get below 10,000 feet for this reason. All of this is going to get its own special episode down the road to dive much deeper into the adaptations and demands and benefits of altitude training. Lactate levels, now here's where we get into some of the invasive measures because you need blood to measure it. It's done exactly the same way as how diabetics check their blood sugar. You got to prick the finger, you squeeze a little bit of blood out, it goes into a little measure, like one of those little sticks, and it measures in millimoles per deciliter. This is your blood lactate level. Remember that when I was talking about heart rate and lactic threshold, this is what the test measures, is the amount of lactate produced in high intensity activity. Your body, once it surpasses your aerobic system, can output and, your body, once it's surpassed what your aerobic system can output and sustain, begins to really break down glucose or sugar in the muscle and blood as the primary fuel source. And due to this being highly inefficient, it also produces a lot of heat. Your body creates metabolic byproducts, with one of them being lactate. In layman's terms, we call it lactic acid, which, sorry to tell you, we humans don't actually produce lactic acid. It requires lactose to be present, which isn't found in our blood. But we call it lactic acid because of the burning feeling we get, which is the body becoming more acidic. So if the lactate levels that are measured is high, you know work capacity is being taxed quite heavily and you're working hard. Next, let's look at blood glucose levels. These will also influence things highly because glucose is one of the main fuel sources for the body. We store glucose in three main places: in the muscles for immediate use, in the blood, which is quickly transported to the muscles and brain, and then in the liver. Now, I just mentioned the brain. That is because the preferred energy source for the brain is glucose. So if our blood glucose levels drop, you end up unable to concentrate and also unable to sustain high intensity effort. You get a little bit of that brain fog type of feeling is the best way to kind of describe this. Worst case scenario is if your glucose levels hit zero, you die. The good thing is our body likes to survive, so it will just stop letting you have that type of output, and it will shut certain things down, such as you're not going to be exercising anymore, you're going to be laying on the ground breathing hard. And this allows you to have time to recover, to break down fat and have it go through the chemical process to become glucose, or it gives you time to be able to have liquid carbs in the form of a glucose concentrated drink, and this allows you to survive. Also, this is one of the reasons why distance athletes drink a sugary drink while they're exercising, because by taking that exogenous or that outside source of carbs, they're able to have a higher output for longer, which allows them to perform at a higher level. Something I'll get into when I start talking about fuel sources for exercise in several episodes down the road is how carbs are the macro of performance. It's the performance nutrient at the end of the day. Now let's take a look at core temperature. This is where there's a little bit of a bell curve to it. If it's too high or it's too low, the body performs like shit. But the closer you get to staying in that middle part of the bell curve, around 37 to 38 degrees Celsius, the more optimal things will typically work. There are multiple ways that temperature can be measured in the body, but its core temperature is what matters for the most part, or the temperature around your primary organs and brain, basically, which requires a bit more invasive methods of probing. Typically, this is only done in laboratory settings and controlled environments, which, let's be honest, that's not how the real world works, but it's still good to know. Most researchers will take core temperature readings three ways. First being tympanic, which is a probe inserted into your ear canal. The second being esophageal, which is a probe inserted up through your nose, down the back of your nasal cavity, down the back of your throat. And then the third one is what we typically associate with being abducted by aliens: anal probing. Yes, you take a temperature probe and insert it up the anus so that it can take your core temperature. So you may recall from that global hysteria we had a few years ago, one of the ways that we can also measure temperature, while not as precise or accurate, is through thermal imaging and skin temperature readings. This can be done either with very expensive thermal imaging cameras and software, or less expensive skin temperature thermometers that basically take a quick little laser reading and it tells what the temperature is. While these are techie ways of checking core temperature, there's also some very simple and common sense ways. If it's cold, you will be cooler, and if it's hot, you will be warmer. Yes, it's that simple at times. For longer duration events like the marathon, you want the temperature to be cool but not cold, because it allows the body to stay cooler but not overheat, but still warm enough that it performs better. The best marathon temperature is in the teens in terms of degrees Celsius. Some athletes prefer it closer to 10 degrees Celsius, some prefer it 15 to 17 degrees Celsius. But nearly none of them want to be running a marathon at 40 degrees Celsius or at 0 degrees, or kind of like your workplace. If it's too chilly, you end up also focusing on that more so than the job at hand. And if it's too hot, you're focusing on that. So finding that happy medium of even the external temperature is going to influence your internal temperature. All right, so the next variable we got to kind of look at in terms of metrics for work capacity is VO2, or volume of oxygen consumed. The aerobic fitness gold standard metric. What it means is the amount of oxygen that your body is using. As the name aerobic exercise implies, it is low to moderate intensity where your body is able to utilize oxygen along with primarily fat or lipids as the energy source efficiently and sufficiently to sustain the exercise demands or whatever demands are upon your body. The issue is, as I covered earlier, we do have higher demands on the body than just what this system can sustain. But the amazing thing about the aerobic metabolism is that it's what we use for sustaining our life for the most part and long duration exercise. In addition, this is our primary way to recover even after a high intensity output. How VO2 is measured is again primarily in the lab, where you're attached to a mask with two tubes, an intake and an outtake tube, along with a one-way valve typically on each side. The air you breathe in has the volume measured along with the proportion of oxygen, roughly 20%. The last time I did a lab with this during my undergrad, it was 20.02% here in Ottawa, for example. Then the air exhaled is also measured for the amount of oxygen it has, which will be less along with the increase in carbon dioxide exhaled. From this, some simple math is done to measure the amount of oxygen being used by the body per minute. This is given in milliliters per kilogram per minute, meaning milliliters of oxygen used per kilogram of body weight every minute. So yes, body weight is going to be taken into account here. You can improve your VO2 max score in a given exercise test in only really two ways: become fitter or lose body fat. Higher scores are better in terms of aerobic fitness and does have a carryover to anaerobic because it allows and demonstrates that you typically recover better while also having a higher threshold before tapping into your anaerobic metabolism work. One thing to keep in mind at the end of all of these that I've gone through is that your heart rate is king. It is going to influence and have a critical impact on your work capacity, regardless of which other measure you use. You can only go so long as your heart sustains you. Now let's look at some ways to track work capacity. The training log. This can be written in a book or a journal or digitally kept, and is the easiest way of tracking work capacity in the weight room and when training in general. It also allows you to not only see what you were able to do today, but also compare to past sessions and then compare the present session to future ones. Just from simple metrics, you can see the total volume or tonnage lifted, the number of reps or sets with a certain weight, where the drop-off point occurred, so when you could no longer keep the same intensity or do as many reps with the same weight. You can also see the total time under tension, or if it was altered, how well you're recovering within the session by the rest taken. With these simple metrics, you can see if things were increased session to session, if the rest required went up or down. For running or conditioning style workouts, you can use many of the same metrics as well in the training log by checking volume or mileage, time for completion of, or the number of running repetitions, or repetitions on the rower, the prowler, or a bike. Different ways, you're just looking at different modalities to basically see the same thing. Are you improving or are you regressing? The goal is always improvement. You can get even fancier by adding in revolutions per minute or strokes and step rate, but really, as long as you're tracking the metrics consistently, you're able to see whether there's progress or regression. A training log is one of the cheapest methods of measuring and tracking work capacity. You can even see fluctuations within and between sessions. The most critical thing here is honesty. At the end of the day, you will only be cheating yourself and lying to yourself by not recording things accurately. So if you do 4.5 reps, no, you did 4 reps. You don't count that half rep because are you sure it wasn't 4.29 reps or it wasn't 4.615 reps? So making sure you only count completed repetitions. My advice is, if you want to get a bit more fancy, is have space for a personal note section where you can state how you felt before, during, and after the session, and anything else you may want to jot down, such as if there was a supplement you had, you slept well, you're just feeling great, work-life balance type stuff. And this type of journal can also be used for life. Journaling is a great way to actually keep track of things day to day. Additionally, with the wave of smartphones, we're given different softwares that come with them, but we call them apps. Today, there are hundreds of apps out there that can keep track of hundreds of metrics associated with your health, fitness, and life. Some even come preloaded on phones, like the Apple Health app, which works primarily, I use it as a pedometer, for example, but there's other metrics you can have in there. Everything from, for women, your sexual health cycle, dealing with your menstrual cycle. You can track your heart rate. You can be tracking many different metrics within it. You can see step length, for example, and as long as you're consistent, you can see where things might be differentiated, and then you're able to have the metrics. There's even some of these apps now are even checking blood saturation, levels of oxygen, where this can be extremely critical for mountain climbers or pilots, glider pilots. All these things can be used quite excellently, for lack of a better term. Some of the apps may require other things like wearables, from a watch to a ring, or even a continuous blood glucose monitor. You have options like Apple or Garmin watches, to Fitbits, their little bracelets. They even make watches now, or Oura and Whoop rings, which looks just like a wedding band or a regular jewelry ring. Just put it on a finger and it keeps track of all kinds of metrics. One thing I do suggest for everybody is do not ever become a slave to the technology and run away from a training session because it says, I'm not optimally recovered. Because to be honest, that could be one of your best sessions, either that week, that month, or ever. And this is what can lead to some of your greatest improvements, mentally and physically. Being able to fight through a shitty day can lead to having even better workouts down the road. Also, in the real world of performances, you don't get to reschedule life or competitions just because your watch says you didn't sleep well. Imagine if a surgeon whose heart rate variability wasn't perfect and then had to go and reschedule surgery. We'd have far worse backlogs than we already do, and we'd have more people dying. The tech is a tool. It is not your overlord. That is the point I'm making here. Use it to help you, and also use it to maybe see where things might be a little off. It can reinforce certain thoughts or feelings you might have, and it could also dispel some things as well. Sometimes you could be feeling off, but you're actually on. So taking a look at all this, these are ways that we can both measure and track our work capacity. At the end of the day, work capacity is the amount of work you can do before you hit the point of fatigue and exhaustion or you break. This translates between the physical domain through the mental domain. Whether you're in a high stress job like you're a nurse, a high pressure salesman, you're a lawyer, you're dealing with a capital murder case, for example. Well, if you're able to handle the mental capacities of that job without breaking and needing stress leave, you are able to perform better for longer. Using the surgical example from before, that is an entire team that has to be able to perform at the zenith of their capabilities in order to save a person's life. At times, it could be multiple teams all working in concert to get that job done. In the tactical world, you have people trying to kill you, for example. That's a high stress environment, plus the extreme physical demands of potentially high heat environment. You could be at high elevations, going to lower elevations. You could be having to take into account everything from humidity, the time of day, the sun angle, to Coriolis effect to perform your job. That is why having the work capacity and improving upon it allows you to do your job better. Now, if you're on the hunt for a high quality protein and other supplements, you can use code RISLING10 for 10% off with HCP Labs at www.hcplab.com. Thank you for listening. You can find me at Wrestling Performance on Instagram and at www.wrestlingperformance.ca online. Remember to subscribe, and thank you for listening to the Podium Performance Podcast. As I continue to cover the foundations of performance, the next episode will be on flexibility and range of motion, the differences and types.